Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Hey there, everybody. Welcome to this special episode of the Lunch Hour, part of our series, REINS Act in Focus. I'm Andrew Langer, your host. Joining me today is someone who's been on the Lunch Hour before. He's a good friend of mine. His name is Wayne Crews. He is the Fred L. Smith Fellow in Regulatory Policy at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. And let's just dive into it, Wayne. The REINS Act, it's been something that's been talked about for a very long time. I don't know if you could talk about how it came about, but your initial impressions when it was proposed as to what it would do, talk about the problems it was going to solve.
Yeah, the big problem that our movement, the liberty movement broadly, has been focused on for years and years has been overdelegation of legislative power by Congress to federal agencies. The REINS Act would require that major rules out of there, you got a few dozen laws every year, you got 3,000 rules and regulations, and then you got a big chunk of those that are major and a larger chunk that are otherwise significant. The REINS Act in its current incarnation would require that major rules be approved by Congress. What we have in place right now, it's been over a generation. We were just talking earlier about some small business reforms, but it's been over a generation since we had regulatory reform in terms of Small Business Regulatory Enforcement Fairness Act, the Congressional Review Act, unfunded mandates reform. The unfunded mandates reform and all of these measures were designed to bring the regulatory state back under control. The Congressional Review Act in particular is what governs now. REINS would boost it. What Congressional Review Act allows now is that of those 3,000 rules that are coming through, Congress can do a resolution of disapproval.
Right.
Just a week ago, Trump signed 3 of them in one day. However, despite a generation of the Congressional Review Act being in place, we've only eliminated fewer than 30 rules out of the 3,000 coming down the pipeline every year.
Wow.
The REINS Act would shift that around on its head and say, no, the major rules can't be in effect until Congress affirms them. Right now, Congress has got to get up on its hind legs and do a resolution of disapproval, which almost never happens, as we see.
Right.
Although when you get a change in administrations, you can get a chunk like we just did. But normally, the regulatory state marches on ahead. So the REINS Act would change that. And as you know, in the budget reconciliation, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, initially, there had been a stripped down version of the REINS Act incorporated in there to require Congress to affirm major rules. But in this case, it would be major rules that affected government revenues and outlays. So because budget rules, especially on the Senate side, it had to be narrowed down. As it happens, though, Andrew, at the very last few minutes before the big, beautiful budget bill was enacted, that got stripped out.
Right.
A lot of people thought the REINS Act survived over into the Senate side where the big, beautiful bill lies now. It's not there.
Wow.
And they're not going to put it back. It's not just that REINS was stripped out, though. I'll tell you this. Unfortunately, there were sunsetting provisions for rules, and like a 20% chunk for over 5 years and scale those down, and they go away unless Congress would affirm them. That would have been a tremendous regulatory reform. That was pulled out. And something very simple, just having GAO do an aggregate cost study. We've already speaking of those reforms, we're supposed to have that now from the Regulatory Right to Know Act. It's ignored.
Absolutely. Sure.
There you go.
all I remember, Wayne, is back in 2010, 2011, when advocacy released that cost of regulation study, what I don't know if it was Crane and Crane or Crane Hopkins at that point. And when it showed that regulations had jumped by about 50% in cost, for small business, the administration then decided not to do it anymore. Let's talk about this, because what I love about CEI and a lot of our allies is that they could talk about these things. The size of government for you guys is not a Republican or Democrat issue. And in fact, it's the size and scope of the power of the federal executive branch that everybody should be concerned about. Talk about how, in an era in which we have deep and abiding concerns about the power of the executive branch, why REINS should be something of interest to folks who, shall we say, have been skeptical about regulatory reform in the past.
Yeah, well, we're looking at a year where the federal spending is going to be 7 trillion this year and a $2 trillion deficit when we're not even in crisis mode. Remember,
Right.
we got our crisis with COVID, and that's when we saw the first $2 trillion deficit. 2 trillion used to be the entire amount of federal outlays
Oh,
back,
yes.
not so long ago. But now regulatory costs, I say they're at least 2 trillion. The Crane
Yeah.
study, the latest Crane study that's been done for the National Association of Manufacturers puts it at 3 trillion.
Right.
You can see Mercatus numbers and others that stick it way above.
Yeah, you,
I think
you, you,
also
me,
extraordinary.
yeah. Dan Goldbeck at AAF and I both think that it's closer to four. And not that I
Mhm.
ever want to quibble with you about these things.
I agree with that.
We all have different ways of doing this. But go
Mhm.
ahead. I'm sorry. Yes. So
Yeah, I agree. I think it's probably even a whole lot more than that.
yeah.
What I'm trying to do, though, is remember I mentioned that Regulatory Right to Know Act. We
Right.
should be looking at environmental, economic, health and safety, paperwork, itemizing that and figuring out what the costs are.
Sure.
Of course, it's the case. We're not central planners. We don't actually think that somebody outside can tell what regulatory costs are. What we're after is that
Mm,
accountability, that very
right.
accountability we were talking about with respect to the REINS Act. So that's why I was particularly disappointed when the cost budget, the cost assessment for GAO got pulled out of the big beautiful bill. That's the simplest low-hanging fruit that you can have. The one thing the bill did have, though, that was a positive was where there were four major reg reform provisions in the big beautiful bill, but they were only funded at 10 million for OMB over the next 10 years.
Right.
But what they switched it with was 100 million for OMB for regulatory review and analysis, just generally.
Mm,
That could, in the current circumstances, could be even better. But what I think we ought to look for on the Senate side with respect to REINS is if the REINS Act was too problematic in a budget reconciliation setting, you had, the REINS, the CRA that come under the jurisdiction of judiciary and oversight and things like that. Instead, if you shift it out with just what we were talking about, a simplified regulatory cost budget only,
right.
not a net budget, because unfortunately the progressives don't see regulations as having any costs at all. And in
Right.
fact, if government to control an entire sector, it's impossible for them to see an incremental move toward government control as costly. It just
Hold on, hold
it
on. Ping on that for a second, Wayne, because I
Mhm.
think that's an important point that people need to understand. That this idea of if government controls an entire sector in this way, you can't get an adequate cost measurement. You can't assess it
Exactly.
because. So go talk a little bit about that real quick.
Exactly. That's why I'm so worried now because with respect to the behavior of both parties, because I've told you before, I've spent my career
Right.
fighting over delegation, but I see the problem now after the CARES Act, Rescue Plan, infrastructure law, inflation law, chips and science law. The problem now is not just over delegation, it's Congress's own disregard of enumerated powers
Right.
and assumption of our Fred Smith at CEI would call it government steering while the market rose. Well,
Right.
that hyper spending we've seen over the past 5 years is already regulatory in nature before the administrators even start picking up their pencils. So in other words, in that situation, REINS will help us, but it doesn't address Congress abusing its powers and creating too many government partnerships and too much intertwining. I've joked to you before that now everything with these new laws, everything from local tap water to space commercialization is a government business project. That's
Right.
not capital or competitive free enterprise.
It is amazing. So, talking about the REINS Act, one of the
Mhm.
fundamental questions I have for you, it's something you and I have talked about, is this issue of what constitutes a major rule. We'll
Yeah,
talk about this also with Ryan Young, your colleague. We're having him on to talk about this as well.
right.
But this issue of how they define, because they have changed the definition, at least at the executive branch side of things, as to what constitutes a major rule. Does REINS get at that? I mean,
Yes.
or more to the point, if we do get a separate standalone REINS Act, or even with this, should there be a standardized definition of what constitutes a major rule so that we can all agree on that at least?
Yes, but I'll say to you, Andrew, it's not enough
Yeah,
because the left and right will never agree that a rule is costly or
sure.
inflicts burdens. And the case will always be made. Remember, Biden had a whole of government regulatory agenda on
Oh,
equity,
yes.
environment, net zero, care economy. The left's goal is a custodial administrative state with government in control in so many areas. So they're never going to see $100 million rule that's major as any way problematic. They're going to
Right.
see the benefits as always outweighing that. So what I think a REINS Act has to do, and I've articulated this quite a lot, is that it's not just that a major rule of $100 million, which was originally defined way back in the Reagan era,
Oh, yeah.
you know, when
Back when
Biden and
$100 million actually meant something. Yeah.
he raised that threshold for major from 100 million to 200 million.
Right.
And now under Trump, it's back down to 100. But you really have to go after rules and regulations that are controversial. So the REINS Act, or it used to have a better name. It was called the Congressional Responsibility Act. That was a
Yes.
much better name and much more fitting in getting at Congress's culpability here. But it would require, having Congress approve those kinds of rules can't just be at a cost threshold. There also has to be provisions there for rules that are controversial,
Right.
or there's a separate question of major questions doctrine when a
Right.
particular government activity is going to have a major effect, a substantial effect on the economy. But remember, big, huge rules like net neutrality was considered prophylactic, not a
Yes.
major rule.
Right.
So some of the largest, the most gargantuan interventions that we've had are things that never were categorized as major rules at all. So there's got to be a way, if you're going to roll things back, you need to go after controversial rules. And simultaneously, we have to challenge these premises of the administrative state, that that's where expertise relies. And that's where we're going to get all the answers, because I don't think, you can't just think up a value and then create an agency named after it and think you're regulating. You've really got to have all these other disciplines in play against companies that misbehave. You can't just do it with an administrative state.
We have as you said, a once in a generation opportunity to make some fundamental changes to how we do business with regards to regulation. I made the point at an event last week, that the choices couldn't be more stark. The savings to the American economy over the long term are clear. In fact, Wayne, before I let you go, this issue of regulatory cost savings and the impact on the economy, talk about how vital that is in terms of America's competitiveness, but also the long-term fiscal health of the country.
Oh, yeah, sure. One of the biggest effects on regulation that isn't measured is the uncertainty that regulations cause. And so that's one of the barriers. You have the question of kind of the revolving door, the rent seeking, the folks who are happy with the regulatory state because they can always get in there, meet with the regulators, set the terms, and have
Right.
and have a party and high five at the end of the day. A lot of businesses, as you find, they like regulation because of the certainty it gives them, but it
Right.
may be the wrong kind of certainty in that it undermines competition. I mean, obviously, antitrust laws are like that, but even things you may not expect, like environmental rules. Sometimes it's very tough to get the automakers, for example, or power companies to go along with changes because they've adapted to them.
Right.
And
Absolutely.
one of the important things to do is recognize that regulations over time have a compounding effect in the economy.
Absolutely.
It's the immediate cost, the compliance cost, and the paperwork and things like that. But to the extent they hobble business creation, hobble employment, hobble wealth creation, the regulatory state's a big barrier. That's why we say, the costs are a lot more than what we're
Right.
talking about as baselines. But we're trying to get the Congress and others to take some ownership of it. And if we have an opportunity on the Senate side with this beautiful bill, so called, and there's lots of debate about it and lots of problems with it, but if we can retain some of the regulatory reforms, one of the easiest should be to take the Democrats up on their regulatory budgeting idea,
Right.
because it was Carter and former Treasury Secretary Lloyd Benson who said it's not just the spending that government does, but it's interventions in the regulatory side that have a big effect on the economy. And we need a budget to take care of that and take that into account. We agree. So
You're
let's do
here.
it. So
Yeah. So our guest has been Wayne Crews. He is the Fred L. Smith Fellow in Regulatory Policy at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. CEI.org is the website. Wayne, thank you so very much for joining us.
you bet. Thank you so much for having me. Always a pleasure. Thanks, Andrew.